Research revolved around the significant shifts in the auto industry over the last decade and then how that's impacted the overall economy. And now that you've combined COVID with it, what type of impact that's had as well. And that's important because when you look at the auto industry, you're talking about a industry that has experienced radical change because of trade policy, changes in customer preferences towards greener automobiles, and supply chain matters prior to COVID. In 2020, the impact of these changes was compounded by the pandemic, and our analysis will illustrate that the future of the industry depends on its ability to adapt to these fluctuations. This matters because the automotive industry is a major industrial and economic force worldwide, responsible for producing an average of more than 77 million cars and trucks a year over the past decade, and responsible for almost half of the world's consumption of oil. 8 million people worked directly for car manufacturers in 2019, while millions more worked for companies that supply complementary goods. So the first thing we want to look at going into the pandemic is what impact trade policy was having on the industry. And you can't talk about trade policy without talking about the 1994 North America Free Trade Agreement. This agreement created the second largest auto parts production region in the world when it integrated operations across Mexico, Canada, and the United States. The impact that it had was very similar to what we saw with the Model T Ford, where costs were driven down significantly and made products more widely affordable for a broader consumer base. As a result, no car is 100% US made, and we rely on 40 to 50% of imported components and parts to manufacture US vehicles. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the auto industry saw 8 years of sustained improvement. 2017 witnessed record-breaking revenues for both car makers and suppliers, where the car makers saw revenues in the billions and suppliers experienced revenue of 620 million. Then in 2018, there were some alterations made to NAFTA, and the regional value content was modified. The North American steel and aluminum purchase requirements were implemented, and labor value content requirements were also included in the changes. So when you talk about vehicle production, you can look at light and medium duty vehicle productions. The US market relies heavily on imported light vehicles and automotive parts. The North American light and medium duty auto market is worth $728 billion annually and represents over a quarter of the global market for new vehicles. NAFTA ranks third globally in terms of light and medium duty vehicle productions. In 2018 alone, the US produced over 11 million light vehicles, which represented 17.3 million in sales. When the Trump administration came along, there were some pretty drastic shifts in trade policy. He opened an investigation on fluctuating tariffs targeting the automotive industry, and in 2019, the administration determined US imports of automobiles and parts threatened national security. By doing this, they were able to use Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which gives the president authority to respond to a threat and impose restrictions. According to the Center for Automotive Research, any new barriers to trade could have a significant impact on the U.S. automotive industry, consumer prices, U.S. sales, employment, and economic output. The Congressional Budget Office added that tariffs will raise domestic prices, thereby reducing the purchasing power of domestic consumers and increasing the cost of business investments. The U.S. auto industry has seen success through a commitment to quality, innovative production, and improved relations with suppliers. New tariffs challenge American companies with less revenue to focus on research and development, which we'll get to later means less shift towards greener production and greener automobiles, and it diminishes competitiveness in the auto market. We're spending more to produce and sell vehicles, and the result is potential for a less productive U.S. market, shutdown of plants, and shift to investments abroad. According to the Tax Foundation model, the tariffs already imposed, threats of additional tariffs, and intentions of other countries to impose tariffs on U.S. exports, in the long run, U.S. GDP could fall by nearly nearly half of a percentage point. Wages could be cut by a third of a percentage point, and employment could be cut by nearly 395,000 jobs. So what we see here is that in 2017, an investigation was initiated by the U.S. regarding China's policies and practices regarding technological transfers, intellectual property, and innovation, and the innovation under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. The U.S. concluded that China was using unfair trade practices. Basically, what ended up happening is we issued tariffs on them, they issued tariffs back, and a trade war started, driving up costs significantly for both countries. In 2018, a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports was implemented. Obviously, this is significant because both of those materials are substantial in the production of automobiles. It forced the prices of steel and aluminum and U.S. produced metals to rise due to an increase in demand. It created a more expensive manufacturing process and increased the cost of U.S. vehicles and parts. Steel is the most expensive that it's been in recent years, and vehicle parts produced in one country are often used for vehicle assembly in another. So the increased cost of vehicle and parts production impacted all three NAFTA countries, not just the United States. So the overall impact of these trade policies is the use of tariffs to encourage domestic production will lead to an ineffective and less productive allocation of resources. An increase in the price of cars sold in the United States will result in customers' purchase decisions to be delayed or geared towards used cars instead of new vehicles, generating inflationary pressures. That's also significant because if customers are therefore encouraged to buy used vehicles, there's less incentive to move in that greener direction that we're going to talk about later. Both the Center of Automotive Research and the Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that a 25% tariff applied to all vehicles sold domestically could raise the price of an average car sold in the United States by over $4,000. So you can see the impact of recent trade policy on the auto industry. Now we're going to move into environmental threats and how that's impacted demand. In addition to the environmental impact of the use of the vehicle itself, significant issues are created from the production and disposal of automobiles. Obviously, driving the cars requires a consumption of high amounts of fossil fuels, and with the increased demand for larger vehicles over the last decade, this consumption was being driven higher. During operation, a vehicle releases carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur and nitrogen oxides, and other harmful gases into the atmosphere. During production, additional environmental impact is created from solid waste generation, emission of VOCs, and significant usage of energy and water. Upon disposal of end-of-life vehicles, a topic of concern in multiple studies, soil and aquifer contamination are problematic as well. And basically, just to understand the significant environmental impact of automobile manufacturing, the UK can be seen as sort of a microcosm of the industry as a whole. In the United Kingdom alone, 5.2 billion liters of water are used and 1 million tons of carbon dioxide are released on a yearly basis simply during production, not during the use of the vehicles, but during the production process alone. Transportation accounted for a quarter of the world's carbon dioxide emissions in 2016. And in addition to the climate effects of simply driving the vehicles, consideration has to be given to infrastructure and traffic delay that lead to increased pollution from the automobiles as they're being used as well. However, if the industry is going to become truly greener and more sustainable in the long run, a multi-tiered approach must be used to get there. Electric vehicles, circular economic practices, cleaner supply chain methods, green construction and production, and a more efficient means of dealing with end-of-life vehicles are all possibilities. What's happened in the last few years is we've seen a significant shift in demand as consumer preferences are shifting as buyers are becoming more critical of firms' environmental performance. Consumer demand for electric vehicles grew 63% in 2018, and these preference shifts account for some of the external pressures that manufacturers are experiencing, in addition to forced reaction to competitor efforts towards greener manufacturing, and supplier requests to become more sustainable as well. So in other words, if Ford says they're going to become greener and that marketing works and their sales start working, then obviously Toyota has to respond to what Ford's doing to move in a greener direction for the overall industry. Those are external pressures that they're experiencing. Internally, companies must consider shifting costs and corporate philosophy. This chart right here is really interesting for two reasons. One is you see an increase starting in 2013. You see it become more drastic in 2016. And another thing that's interesting, if you look at this light blue, this represents China, and the light and dark blue. And this is all electric car deployment in these countries. So basically what you can see is demand in these selected countries. The previous chart illustrates a rapid shift in numbers of electric vehicles on the road over a 5-year period. Nearly half of electric cars in 2018 were in China, compared to 39% just a year earlier. By comparison, Europe accounted for almost a quarter of EVs on Earth, while the US came in with just over 1/5. The data in this chart is proof that shift in demand for a greener auto industry is definitely a global phenomenon, but it also demonstrates the rate and increased demand was experiencing a sharp incline at the close of the previous decade. So in other words, the rate of demand was going up pretty steady, and then all of a sudden, as the last decade ended, it went up. It started to go up pretty drastically. Because of increased short-term cost of greener production and the subsequent higher prices for greener automobiles that are then passed along to the customer, nations with a greater price elasticity of demand can be slower to transitioning. This is particularly important due to the fact that estimates predict that 90% of all emissions over the next decade will come from outside the United States. Here you can see some pros and cons for electric vehicles. Obviously there's no tailpipe emissions. You can refuel them at home. It is a problem though, because then when you get away from the home, it becomes a little more challenging to refuel. And then also we already talked about the more expensive purchase price that currently exists. The demand for greener vehicles continues to grow steadily. And in 2018, a really interesting study surveyed 8,000 consumers from Brazil, China, France, Germany, India, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the study's interesting because you end up with people from 4 different continents weighing in. And 55% of those people said that they own a fuel-efficient or alternative fuel vehicle, up from 43% just 8 years earlier. And 82% of those people expect full electric vehicles to become a viable option within the next 5 to 7 next 5 to 7 years. What consumers are demanding from the industry is viability, fuel efficiency, technology that creates high performance, high efficiency, and low consumption, and high safety. What can drive that demand higher is if the manufacturer and even the government can help with purchase subsidies, charging infrastructure, fee reduction, and tax reduction. What's really interesting that the next 3 graphics are going to illustrate is that this group that was surveyed obviously sees the need or the positive impact that electric vehicles can have to combat climate change. But what each chart will illustrate is their lack of willingness to invest greater money than what they would pay for traditional automobiles. They basically are looking to see if it can save them money. You see the same thing with this one. This is chart 2 of the 3. And then right here, we can see our countries coming up again from multiple continents. You see the numbers of awareness are really high. Serious consideration, we start to drop. And then with a concrete purchase plan, we see an even more significant drop. According to the Capgemini Research Institute, in order for automotive firms to meet their sustainability targets, which one could assume coincides with meeting customer preference for a greener industry, an estimated $50 billion will need to be spent in the next 5 years. So it's not going to be easy to make this transition.